Picture this: a vast cityscape, its towering pyramids and sprawling palaces now swallowed by jungle vines or half buried in desert sands. The air hums with the ghosts of a civilization that once thrived here, their voices silenced by time. What happened to these people? How could empires that ruled for centuries suddenly vanish, leaving behind only fragments of their grandeur? These aren't just stories from dusty history books. They're real mysteries waiting to be solved. From the jungles of Cambodia to the heart of the Yucatan, the ruins of ancient empires hold secrets that still baffle archaeologists today. And the truth: their collapses might hold eerie parallels to our own world. Think about the Maya, a society so advanced they mapped the stars with precision, built cities without modern tools, and then disappeared. Or the Khmer Empire, whose awe-inspiring temples at Angkor Wat stand as a testament to their power, yet their downfall remains shrouded in mystery. Were these civilizations brought low by war, famine, or something even more unpredictable? The clues are etched into the stones they left behind, whispering tales of ambition, ingenuity, and ultimately catastrophe. These weren't just random events, they were turning points that reshaped history. And here's the thing: we're still learning from them. This isn't just a journey into the past, it's a detective story where every clue leads us deeper into the unknown. What if the fall of these empires holds warnings for us today? Could climate change, resource shortages, or societal divisions, the same forces that toppled giants of antiquity, be lurking in our own future? As we explore these ancient disappearances, we'll uncover not just what happened, but why it matters now. So settle in, because by the end of this video, you'll see these vanished worlds in a whole new light, and maybe even glimpse what their stories can teach us about resilience, survival, and the fragile threads that hold civilizations together. The past is speaking. Are you ready to listen? Every great civilization starts with a spark, an idea, a discovery, or a moment of unity that propels people forward. Think of the Roman Empire, whose roads and laws stretched across continents, or the Inca, who carved cities into mountaintops. These societies didn't just grow, they thrived, innovated, and seemed unstoppable. So what went wrong? Why do empires that once commanded the world suddenly crumble into dust? The truth is, collapse rarely comes from a single blow. It's a slow unraveling, a web of interconnected pressures that eventually becomes too much to bear. Take environmental degradation, for instance. The ancient Maya mastered agriculture, building elaborate irrigation systems to feed their booming cities. But their success may have been their undoing. As populations grew, forests were cleared, soil was exhausted, and droughts struck with devastating force. Sound familiar? Today, we face similar challenges: vanishing water supplies, shifting climates, and the strain of feeding billions. The Maya didn't have satellites or climate models to warn them. We do, yet their story begs the question: are we paying attention? Then there's economic instability. The Roman Empire's vast trade networks brought riches, but they also created dependency. When inflation spiraled and resources dwindled, the system began to crack. Coins lost their value, merchants struggled, and the empire's once unshakable foundation started to wobble. Fast forward to modern times, global markets, supply chains, and financial systems are more interconnected than ever. Could a single rupture send shockwaves through our own economies? History suggests it's not just possible, it's happened before. And what about external threats? The Khmer Empire of Angkor faced relentless pressure from rival kingdoms, while the Bronze Age civilizations collapsed under waves of invasions, droughts, and rebellions. A perfect storm of disasters. But here's the twist: many empires don't fall to outside forces alone. Internal divisions weaken them first. Distant provinces rebel, leaders grow out of touch, and trust in the system erodes. Are we seeing echoes of this today? Political polarization, social unrest, and the struggle to adapt to rapid change. These aren't just modern problems. They're age-old tests that toppled civilizations long before us. The chilling reality is this: no empire lasts forever, but that doesn't mean collapse is inevitable. Clues left behind: broken statues, abandoned cities, faded records aren't just relics. They're lessons. The Maya, the Romans, the Khmer, they all faced challenges not so different from ours. They adapted, sometimes successfully, sometimes too late. Their stories aren't just about endings, they're about choices, and right now we're making ours. The ruins of the past aren't just silent witnesses, they're voices calling across time, urging us to learn before it's too late. The question isn't whether history will repeat itself. It's whether we'll listen. Deep in the emerald heart of the Central American jungles, the Maya crafted a civilization that defied the wilderness around them. Their cities like Tikal and Palenque rose like stone giants, their pyramids piercing the canopy as monuments to human ingenuity. These weren't just settlements, they were masterpieces of urban planning, with observatories tracking celestial cycles and reservoirs engineered to outlast the dry season. For centuries, the Maya flourished, their scribes recording history in intricate glyphs, their mathematicians calculating time with precision we'd struggle to replicate even today. Then, almost abruptly, their great cities fell silent. The jungle crept back in, swallowing plazas where crowds once gathered, and the echoes of a thriving society faded into legend. What could topple such a sophisticated world? The answer, it turns out, wasn't a single cataclysm but a cascade of crises. Climate records etched into ancient cave stalagmites reveal a haunting pattern: decades of relentless drought. Imagine the panic as reservoirs dried up, crops failed, and the life-giving rains didn't come year after year. The Maya had weathered dry spells before, but this was different. Their survival depended on careful water management, and as the crisis deepened, so did the cracks in their society. Kings who promised harmony with the gods lost credibility when prayers went unanswered. Trade networks frayed as resources grew scarce, and then the wars began. Archaeologists find chilling evidence in the ruins: mass graves, hastily built fortifications, and the scorch marks of burned temples. The Maya didn't just suffer, they turned on each other. City-states that once traded jade and cocoa now raided for survival. Yet even warfare doesn't fully explain the scale of abandonment. Some cities held on longer than others, adapting in desperate ways. In the Patane region, farmers terraced hillsides to trap precious rainwater, while elsewhere, people retreated to remote villages, returning to simpler ways of life. The collapse wasn't uniform, it was a slow unraveling, a story of resilience giving way to inevitable change. But here's the twist: the Maya never truly vanished. Millions of their descendants still live across the region, preserving languages, traditions, and knowledge that stretch back millennia. Their ancestors' downfall wasn't extinction, it was transformation. The great cities may have emptied, but the people adapted, dispersing into smaller communities or blending with new cultures. This nuance is often overlooked in tales of mysterious disappearances. The real lesson isn't about inevitability, it's about fragility. The Maya mastered their environment until they couldn't, and their story mirrors challenges we face today: climate volatility, resource strain, and the peril of trusting too deeply in systems that can falter. What makes their collapse so haunting isn't just the scale of their achievements, but how familiar their struggles feel. We've built cities just as grand, systems just as complex, and like the Maya, we're testing the limits of our environment. The difference: we can read their history like a warning etched in stone. The jungle didn't conquer the Maya, a web of interconnected pressures did, and that web is something we're still learning to navigate, one thread at a time. The Khmer Empire's mastery of water was nothing short of architectural alchemy. At its peak, Angkor was a hydraulic wonder, a sprawling metropolis laced with canals, reservoirs, and intricate moats that turned monsoon rains into lifeblood. The West Barre, a man-made lake stretching over 5 miles, wasn't just a water source, it was a symbol of control over nature itself. But like all illusions of permanence, this system had a flaw. The monsoons, reliable for centuries, began to shift. Tree-ring studies from the region reveal a haunting truth. Prolonged droughts gripped the land just as the empire reached its zenith. The very water that built Angkor Wat may have sealed its fate. What's chilling isn't just the drought, it's how the Khmer's brilliance became their vulnerability. Their canals and reservoirs were engineered for predictable rainfall, not the erratic cycles that followed. When the rains faltered, the barre sat half empty and rice paddies withered. But here's the twist. Archaeologists have found evidence of desperate repairs, leaky dams patched, canals rerouted. The Khmer knew their system was failing. Yet even their ingenuity couldn't outpace a changing climate. This wasn't negligence, it was a civilization trapped by its own success, doubling down on solutions that no longer worked. The collapse wasn't sudden. Angkor's decline played out over generations, a slow bleed of power as provinces broke away and rival kingdoms sensed weakness. Inscriptions tell of later kings pleading for loyalty, their authority crumbling like the silt-clogged canals, yet the greatest lesson lies in what survived. While the political empire faded, the people adapted. Villagers shifted to flood-resistant crops, and smaller communities thrived where the mega-city couldn't. The Khmer's story isn't one of defeat, it's a case study in resilience, showing how societies fracture and reform under pressure. Today, as engineers wrestle with sinking cities and vanishing aquifers, Angkor's ghost whispers a warning. We've built our own versions of the West Barre, vast dams, irrigation networks, cities sucking rivers dry. But climate shifts aren't medieval myths, they're measurable realities. The Khmer couldn't see the monsoon patterns changing. We have satellites, climate models, and centuries of data. Their downfall asks us, when the next drought comes, will our systems bend? Or will we, like them, keep pouring resources into solutions that no longer fit the world we live in? The stones of Angkor don't just mark a fallen empire. They're mileposts on humanity's long, uncertain journey with nature. Imagine waking up one day to find the world as you know it gone. Not just your city, but every major power on the map, their grand capitals reduced to rubble. This wasn't the plot of a dystopian novel, it actually happened. Around 1200 BCE, the Mediterranean world witnessed something unprecedented, the near-total collapse of advanced civilizations in a staggeringly short time. The mighty Hittites, the prosperous Mycenaeans, the wealthy merchants of Ugarit all vanished almost simultaneously, their palaces burned, their trade networks severed, their languages forgotten. Archaeologists call it the Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of history's most chilling mysteries. What could possibly bring down an entire interconnected world? Theories abound, but one name echoes through ancient texts like a harbinger of doom: the Sea Peoples. Egyptian hieroglyphs depict them as ruthless marauders, sweeping in on ships to sack cities and leave chaos in their wake. A pharaoh's inscription boasts of defeating them, but the damage was done. Coastal cities from Troy to Gaza show layers of ash, as if a wave of fire rolled across the coastline. Yet here's the puzzle. Invaders alone rarely topple civilizations. Most empires withstand raids unless they're already weakened. And the Bronze Age world was cracking under other pressures long before the first ship appeared on the horizon. Droughts had gripped the region for decades, choking harvests and straining fragile supply chains. Clay tablets from the dying city of Ugarit begged neighboring kings for grain shipments, their desperate words preserved in baked mud. At the same time, earthquakes rocked the Aegean, toppling fortress walls and disrupting trade routes. But perhaps most devastating was the invisible crisis: economic collapse. The Bronze Age ran on bronze, an alloy of copper and tin traded across vast distances. When that system faltered, armies couldn't arm their soldiers, farmers couldn't repair tools, and the delicate web of interdependence snapped. Kingdoms that had thrived on exchange suddenly found themselves isolated, vulnerable, and starving. What makes this collapse so eerie isn't just its scale, it's the parallels to our globalized age. Like the Bronze Age world, we rely on intricate supply chains, delicate climate balances, and technologies that demand rare resources. A drought in one country raises bread prices continents away. A blocked waterway sends shockwaves through shipping lanes. The Sea Peoples might seem like ancient bogeymen, but their lesson is timeless. Civilizations don't crumble from a single blow. They fracture when too many stresses converge, environmental, economic, political, until the weight becomes unbearable. The ruins of the Bronze Age whisper a warning we do well to hear. After the collapse, writing systems disappeared for centuries, entire technologies were lost, and a dark age settled over the Mediterranean. But from the ashes rose new powers, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, who rebuilt with hard-won wisdom. The question isn't whether complex societies can fall. History shouts that they can. The real mystery is whether we'll learn from those who came before us or be doomed to repeat their unraveling. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro stretch in perfect grid lines, their baked brick homes equipped with indoor plumbing and drainage systems that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. This wasn't just a settlement, it was a marvel of urban design, a testament to the Indus Valley civilization's staggering sophistication. Flourishing around 2600 BCE, their cities dotted the floodplains of modern-day Pakistan and India, their artisans crafting intricate jewelry, their traders sailing as far as Mesopotamia. Then, without so much as a battle cry or a scorched wall to mark their end, they faded into silence. No sacked temples, no hastily built fortifications, just empty streets and unanswered questions. How does an empire this advanced simply walk away? The mystery deepens when you realize what archaeologists haven't found. Unlike the Maya or the Khmer, there's no evidence of invasion, no mass graves or weapon-strewn battlefields. Even their art shies away from depictions of war, favoring serene animal motifs and enigmatic seal carvings. This was a society that seemed to prioritize order over conquest, cooperation over conflict. So if violence didn't topple them, what did? The clues might lie beneath their feet, literally. Core samples drilled from the Indus River basin reveal a startling shift. The rivers that once nourished their fields began to wander. Imagine the upheaval as the life-giving waters changed course, leaving canals dry and harvests stunted. Satellite imagery shows ancient riverbeds branching like ghostly fingers across the landscape, confirming what geological surveys suggest: this was a landscape in flux. But the Indus people were master adapters. Their cities had weathered floods before, rebuilding with meticulous precision. Why couldn't they survive this time? The answer might lie in something far subtler than disaster: slow, relentless change. When your entire economy depends on predictable floods to irrigate crops, even a minor shift can unravel the system. Trade routes faltered as agricultural surpluses dwindled. Craftsmen who once exported beads and cotton found their markets shrinking, and without a centralized monarchy to rally them, Indus cities show little evidence of kings or palaces. The social contract may have simply frayed until staying meant starving. Yet here's the most haunting part: they didn't disappear. Like the Maya, the Indus people likely dispersed, blending into smaller communities or migrating eastward toward the Ganges. Modern genetic studies trace their legacy in populations across South Asia, their languages possibly evolving into those still spoken today. Their collapse wasn't an annihilation, it was a transformation, a quiet rebooting of society on a smaller, more sustainable scale. That's the real lesson of Mohenjo-Daro's empty streets. Resilience doesn't always mean rebuilding towers. Sometimes it means knowing when to walk away, carrying forward what works and leaving behind what doesn't. In an age obsessed with growth, their story asks uncomfortable questions. What if decline isn't failure but adaptation? What if the most advanced response to crisis isn't doubling down on old systems but finding new ones? The Indus Valley's ruins stand as a counterpoint to the dramatic falls of Rome or Ankara, proof that collapse can be silent, pragmatic, and even wise. Their greatest innovation wasn't their plumbing or their grid plans. It was their willingness to change course without a fight, to vanish not with a bang, but with the quiet dignity of a civilization that knew when to let go. High atop the sun-baked mesas of the American Southwest, the ancestral Pueblones, often called the Anasazi, carved their homes into sheer cliff faces, turning rock into shelter with breathtaking precision. Their dwellings at places like Mesa Verde and Choco Canyon weren't just practical. They were feats of engineering, perched like eagles' nests against canyon walls, with handholds and ladders the only way in or out. These were communities designed for security, for survival. Yet by the late 1300s, the cliffs stood empty, the hearths gone cold. What force could drive a people to abandon such carefully crafted sanctuaries? The answer lies in the very landscape that once sustained them. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, paints a grim picture. For decades, drought gripped the region, withering crops and parching the thin soils. The Anasazi had thrived by mastering dryl and farming, coaxing maize, beans, and squash from the arid earth. But when the rains vanished for generations, even their ingenuity reached its limits. Archaeologists find haunting evidence in the ruins: storage rooms stripped bare, doors deliberately sealed as if to protect something precious, and petroglyphs depicting figures with hollow eyes, their arms raised in what might be prayer or despair. This wasn't just a bad season, it was a slow, suffocating crisis. Yet drought alone doesn't explain the violence etched into some sites. At certain pueblos, walls bear the scars of fire, and human remains show signs of trauma. Were the Anasazi torn apart by conflict as resources dwindled? Or did outsiders, equally desperate, raid their stores? The truth may be uglier still, a breakdown of the social ties that had once bound them together. In good times, they'd traded turquoise and pottery across vast networks. In bad times, trust may have crumbled faster than the soil, but here's the twist: the Anasazi didn't vanish. Like the Maya and the Indus people, they adapted. Their descendants, the Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo tribes, still honor their legacy through oral traditions and ceremonies. The disappearance was really a dispersal, a retreat to more sustainable lands along the Rio Grande. Those staggering cliff dwellings, they weren't tombs. They were waypoints in a longer journey, proof that survival sometimes means leaving behind what no longer serves you. Standing in the ruins today, it's impossible not to see modern parallels. The Southwest now faces its worst drought in over a millennium, with reservoirs sinking and cities rationing water. Like the Anasazi, we've built marvels, dams, aqueducts, sprawling farms, on the assumption that nature will cooperate. But what happens when it doesn't? Their story isn't a prophecy, it's a mirror. They didn't have satellites to track weather patterns or desalination plants to turn seawater into sustenance. We do. The question is whether we'll use that advantage to innovate or cling to cliffs until they crumble beneath us. The Anasazi's greatest lesson isn't about how civilizations fall. It's about the courage to walk away before the last drop is gone. The island of Crete once hummed with the vibrant energy of the Minoans, a people so ahead of their time, they built multi-story palaces with flush toilets and frescoes so lifelike they seemed to breathe. Their artists painted dolphins leaping through azure waves, their traders crisscrossed the Mediterranean, and their bull-leaping ceremonies hinted at a culture both sophisticated and daring. Then, around 1600 BCE, disaster struck from the sea. The volcanic island of Thera, just 70 miles north, erupted with a force estimated to be 10 times stronger than Krakatoa. Tsunamis surged toward Crete, ash blotted out the sun, and in a geological instant, the Minoans' world was thrown into chaos. But was this cataclysm really the end of their story, or just the beginning of their unraveling? Digging through the layers of ash and time, archaeologists have uncovered a more complicated truth. The immediate aftermath of Thera's explosion was undeniably devastating. Coastal settlements like Amnisos were swept away by towering waves, their rubble strewn inland like driftwood. Yet at Knossos, the grandest of the Minoan palaces, life persisted. The walls still stood, the frescoes remained vibrant, and trade goods from Egypt and Anatolia continued to arrive. This wasn't a civilization snuffed out in a day. It was one clinging to survival, adapting to a world suddenly tilted off its axis. The real crisis may have been quieter, but just as deadly. Thera's ash cloud choked the skies, triggering years of failed harvests across the region. Minoan ships, once the backbone of their wealth, found ports in ruins or rivals cutting off their routes. Without trade, the palace economies that relied on imported luxuries and raw materials began to crumble. Then came the Mycenaeans, warriors from mainland Greece who saw weakness as an opportunity. By 1400 BCE, Knossos burned, its final days marked by hastily dug mass graves and Mycenaean weapons littering the halls. The Minoans didn't just fall to nature's wrath, they were caught in a perfect storm of environmental disaster, economic collapse, and human ambition. Yet their legacy refuses to fade. The bull-leaping frescoes that inspired Greek myths of the Minotaur, the flowing art that echoes in later Greek pottery, even the idea of a thalassocracy, a maritime empire, all whisper of their influence. The Minoans' greatest lesson isn't about how civilizations die, but how they endure in unexpected ways. When Thera erupted, it didn't just bury a city, it scattered a culture like seeds on the wind. Today, as we face our own rising seas and shaking ground, their story asks us, what will we leave behind when the waves come? Not just ruins, but echoes. Not just an end, but a beginning. Rome's decline didn't happen in a single catastrophic moment. No sacked city or decisive battle marked its end. Instead, it was a slow bleed, a centuries-long unraveling where the empire's grandeur gave way to grinding decay. Picture this: sprawling frontier garrisons underpaid and undersupplied, bureaucrats more focused on lining their pockets than governing, and a capital city where the once mighty Senate devolved into a stage for petty squabbles. The Roman Empire didn't collapse overnight. It eroded like a statue worn smooth by relentless tides. But why? What made an empire that had weathered crises for half a millennium finally buckle under its own weight? One of Rome's greatest strengths, its vast size, became its Achilles' heel. At its peak, the empire stretched from the misty highlands of Scotland to the deserts of Syria, a tapestry of cultures held together by roads, legions, and sheer bureaucratic will. But maintaining such a colossal territory demanded staggering resources. Tax revenues drained to fund distant wars, while local governors grew increasingly autonomous, some even declaring their own mini-empires. The historian Cassius Dio lamented that by the 3rd century, emperors were chosen like lottery tickets, their reigns measured in months before assassination or rebellion cut them short. Stability became a fleeting dream, and with each power struggle, the empire's cohesion weakened a little more. Then there were the barbarians, not the mindless hordes of popular imagination, but complex societies on Rome's borders, watching and learning. The Goths, Franks, and Vandals weren't just invaders. They were former allies, mercenaries, and trading partners who'd grown disillusioned with Roman promises. When the Huns pushed westward, these groups had nowhere to go but into Roman territory, not as conquerors at first, but as desperate refugees, the empire's response. Half-hearted treaties, broken agreements, and occasional massacres that only fueled resentment. By the time Alaric's Visigoths sacked Rome in 410, it was less a conquest and more a final symptom of a system that had already failed its people. Yet here's the twist: Rome never truly vanished. In the East, the Byzantine Empire carried its legacy for another 1,000 years, preserving laws, art, and architecture. In the West, Roman roads still guided travelers, and Latin evolved into the Romance languages. Even the Catholic Church became a keeper of Roman administrative traditions. The empire didn't so much fall as fracture; its pieces reshaped into something new. That's the real lesson of Rome, not just about the fragility of power, but about the stubborn persistence of ideas. Empires may fade, but their influence lingers, woven into the fabric of whatever rises next. Today, as globalization stretches economies and political tensions test alliances, Rome's ghost whispers warnings we'd do well to heed. Overextension, inequality, institutional decay, these aren't ancient problems, they're human ones. The difference is, we have the luxury of looking back at Rome's long goodbye and asking, when the next crisis comes, will we cling to broken systems or find the courage to rebuild? The answer might determine whether future historians remember us as another cautionary tale, or the generation that learned from the past just in time. High in the rugged highlands of northern Ethiopia, the stone obelisks of Aksum pierce the sky like frozen giants, their intricate carvings whispering of an empire that once rivaled Rome and Persia. At its height, the Aksumite Empire commanded the Red Sea trade, minted its own gold coins, and even inspired legends of the Queen of Sheba. Its merchants sailed to India, its armies conquered Arabia, and its kings were among the first rulers to embrace Christianity. Yet by the 8th century, this African powerhouse had receded into the mist of history, its grand palaces swallowed by encroaching soil, its ports silent. What could bring low a civilization that seemed destined to endure? The first clue lies in the land itself. Aksum's wealth relied on fertile highlands where farmers grew teff and sorghum, fed by reliable monsoon rains. But core samples from nearby lakes tell a troubling story, a centuries-long drying trend that turned lush fields into dust. Unlike the Maya or Khmer, Aksum wasn't just facing drought, it was battling deforestation. To build their towering stelae and sprawling cities, they felled vast forests, triggering soil erosion that choked rivers and aquifers. The very monuments meant to proclaim their power may have hastened their decline. Yet this wasn't an overnight collapse. Archaeologists find evidence of ingenious adaptation: terraced fields to conserve water, shifting trade routes to bypass failing ports. Aksum didn't succumb easily. It fought for survival with every tool at its disposal. Then came the economic storm. Aksum's lifeblood was trade. Luxuries like ivory, frankincense, and exotic animals flowed through its ports to Rome, India, and beyond. But when the Sasanian Empire choked off Red Sea routes and the rise of Islam rerouted commerce through Persia, Aksum found itself stranded on the wrong side of history. Coins minted in later years contain less and less gold, a silent testament to fading influence. Unlike Rome's dramatic sack or Anka's slow abandonment, Aksum's decline was a quiet fading, a dimming rather than a crash. But here's what makes Aksum's story extraordinary. Its legacy didn't disappear. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, the sacred ark of the covenant tradition, even the Jaz script still used in Ethiopia today, all carry echoes of Aksum's golden age. Their downfall wasn't extinction, it was metamorphosis. When the stelae were toppled by earthquakes or neglect, the people adapted, blending old traditions with new faiths and identities. That's the untold lesson of Aksum. Civilizations don't always end in fire or famine. Sometimes they dissolve like salt in water, invisible but still present, their essence lingering in the stories, stones, and bloodlines of those who came after. Standing before those weathered obelisks today, you're not just looking at ruins, you're seeing a mirror. In an era of shifting trade alliances, climate pressures, and cultural reinvention, Aksum asks us, what does true resilience look like? Is it clinging to greatness at all costs, or knowing when to let an empire fade so a people can endure? The stones don't answer, but they stand as silent witnesses inviting us to listen. Beneath the steamy jungles of Mexico's Gulf Coast, the Olmec built a civilization so foundational that later cultures like the Maya and Aztec would inherit their gods, their art, and even their ball game. Their most iconic creations, massive stone heads weighing up to 40 tons, each carved with unmistakable, helmet-like visages, stand as silent sentinels of a people who thrived over 3,000 years ago. Yet despite their towering achievements, the Olmec didn't just fade away. They slipped into obscurity so completely that their very name was lost until modern archaeologists pieced together their story. What could topple a society so influential that its echoes still resonate across millennia? Theories swirl like the mists over their abandoned ceremonial centers. At La Venta and San Lorenzo, their grandest cities, archaeologists uncover clues of deliberate destruction, monuments defaced, altars shattered. Some suggest internal uprisings, a rebellion against rulers whose demands grew too heavy. Others point to environmental pressures. The Olmec's heartland was a watery world of swamps and rivers, perfect for the crops that fed their cities, until it wasn't. Sediment cores reveal periods of devastating floods, followed by droughts that would have turned their fertile fields to dust. Imagine the desperation as harvests failed, as the very earth that sustained them turned hostile. But here's the twist: the Olmec didn't exactly disappear. Their artifacts reappear far beyond their homeland, jade carvings in the highlands. Their signature were jaguar motifs etched into pottery hundreds of miles away. This wasn't a collapse, it was a diaspora. As their cities emptied, their people likely dispersed, carrying their knowledge with them, the Maya's long count calendar. It may have Olmec roots. The Aztecs' feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl. Traces of his worship appear in Olmec ruins centuries earlier. Their downfall wasn't an ending, it was a scattering, a cultural seeds carried on the wind to take root elsewhere. What makes the Olmec's fate so haunting isn't just the mystery of their decline, but how much they accomplished in their fleeting zenith. They devised early forms of writing, engineered elaborate drainage systems, and traded obsidian and jade across vast networks, all without pack animals or metal tools. Their colossal heads, each uniquely individualized, suggest a society that revered its leaders as near divine. Yet their artwork also depicts playful children and intimate domestic scenes. They were both monumental and profoundly human. Today, as modern farmers near Veracruz battle rising waters and unpredictable rains, the Olmec story feels unnervingly relevant. They mastered their environment until they couldn't, and their legacy challenges our assumptions about collapse. Sometimes the end of a civilization isn't failure, it's transformation. The Olmec didn't vanish, they became the blueprint for everything that followed. Their stone heads still stare out from the jungle, not as tombstones but as reminders. The greatest cultures never truly die. They evolve. The Hittites carved their empire from the rocky heart of Anatolia, a civilization of chariot warriors and shrewd diplomats who bargained as deftly as they battled. At their peak, they clashed with Egypt's Ramses II at Kadesh, a showdown so legendary both sides claimed victory. Their capital, Hattusa, was a marvel of fortified walls and secret tunnels, its libraries packed with cuneiform tablets detailing everything from grain shipments to apocalyptic prophecies. Yet around 1200 BCE, this powerhouse vanished almost overnight, its gates left ajar, its temples reduced to charred rubble. The mystery, their end wasn't just sudden, it was strangely self-aware. Those clay tablets tell a haunting story. In the empire's final years, King Suppiluliuma II frantically wrote of rebellions erupting across his realm, of vassal kings refusing to send troops, of food shortages so severe that soldiers deserted to forage. One letter pleads with a subordinate, "Why do you withhold your hand? The enemy marches and we starve." This wasn't just an empire under siege, it was one unraveling from within. The Hittites had faced invaders before, but never while already bleeding from self-inflicted wounds. By the time the so-called Sea Peoples arrived, if they even did, Hattusa may have been a ghost town. But who were these enigmatic Sea Peoples? Egyptian reliefs depict them as a chaotic horde, their ships prowling the coast like wolves. Yet the Hittites' own records never name them directly. Some archaeologists argue the invasion was less a foreign conquest and more a perfect storm. Droughts driving desperate migrations, rebellions boiling over, and opportunistic raiders exploiting the chaos. At Hattusa, there's no layer of foreign artifacts atop the ruins, just ash and abandoned weapons. The truth may be grimmer than any outside threat. The Hittites' rigid hierarchy, dependent on a godlike king and fractious nobles, could have cracked under pressure. When the grain stores ran low, loyalty evaporated. Yet even in collapse, they left clues to their resilience. Refugees from Hattusa likely fled southeast, where small Neo-Hittite kingdoms kept their language and traditions alive for centuries. Their legal codes, some of history's most progressive, influenced later empires, and their greatest innovation, treaties built on parity rather than subjugation, became a blueprint for diplomacy. The Hittites didn't just vanish, they scattered, their legacy seeping into the bones of every empire that followed. Their downfall whispers a warning we've heard before. No walls are high enough to withstand a society turning on itself. The enemy at the gates is fearsome, but the enemy within, that's the one history never forgives. In the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Sumerians built humanity's first known cities, Uruk, Lagash, rising from the mud like miracles. These weren't just settlements, they were the birthplace of civilization itself. Here, writing was invented, not for poetry or prayer, but for accounting. The world's first legal codes were etched into clay tablets, and temples called ziggurats reached for the heavens. Yet within centuries, their fields turned white with salt, their cities emptied, and the very innovations that made them great became relics buried beneath the sands. How does a society that literally wrote the first chapter of human history vanish from its own story? The answer might lie in the soil. Sumer's agricultural genius, complex irrigation networks diverting river water to arid fields, was also its fatal flaw. With each harvest, evaporated water left behind mineral deposits, slowly poisoning the land. Cuneiform tablets from Lagash lament crops yielding black barley, a sign of advanced salinization. Archaeologists studying sediment layers confirm it. The earth became so toxic that wheat, their staple crop, could no longer grow. Farmers switched to more salt-tolerant barley, but even that failed as the crisis deepened. Imagine the dread as entire city-states watched their breadbasket turn barren, their surplus evaporating like the water that doomed them. Yet environmental collapse doesn't exist in a vacuum. As harvests dwindled, so did Sumer's unity. Rival city-states began warring over dwindling resources, their epic battles recorded in boastful inscriptions. He filled the canals with blood. One king wrote of his conquest, but war wasn't the only threat. Tablets from describe waves of nomadic Amorites migrating into Sumer, not as invaders, but as desperate refugees fleeing their own droughts. The Sumerians, weakened and divided, couldn't integrate them or resist their eventual rise to power. What makes Sumer's fall so haunting isn't just its historical significance, but its humanity. Their tablets don't just record laws and ledgers, they capture fear. One scribe wrote of omens, flaming stars, and mutated births, as if the cosmos itself warned of their demise. Another pleaded with the gods to reverse a decision. Why have you abandoned the land like a lying donkey? This wasn't just a civilization collapsing, it was one acutely aware of its own unraveling. The lesson here isn't about inevitability. Sumer's descendants didn't vanish. They blended into the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians who followed, their cuneiform script surviving for millennia. Their true legacy is a warning etched in clay. No society, no matter how brilliant, is immune to the consequences of its own success. The same rivers that gave them life carried the seeds of their decline. Today, as rising soil salinity threatens farms from California to Pakistan, Sumer's ghosts whisper a question across 6,000 years. Will we learn from the first civilization to fall or repeat their silent crisis? The citadel of Mycenae still stands guard over the Greek Peloponnese, its cyclopean walls so massive that later civilizations swore only giants could have built them. Here, beneath the famous Lion Gate, kings once ruled a network of warrior states that inspired the legends of Agamemnon and the Trojan War. Their palaces gleamed with gold from Egypt. Their scribes recorded inventories in an enigmatic script called Linear B, and their ships dominated the Mediterranean. Yet by 1100 BCE, fire consumed the great halls, the writing system vanished, and Greece plunged into a 300-year dark age. What could bring down a civilization so powerful that its myths still shape our imagination? Beneath the layers of ash and time, archaeologists uncover a tale of interconnected disasters. First came the tremors, seismic shocks that rattled the very foundations of Mycenaean strongholds. At Turin's, massive walls toppled like children's blocks, while at Pylos, storerooms collapsed under their own weight. These weren't just earthquakes, they were existential threats. Imagine the terror as priests pleaded with Poseidon, the earth shaker, while the ground itself rebelled. But the earth wasn't done yet. Tree rings from the period reveal years of relentless drought, fields that once fed armies now baked to dust. The Linear B tablets, typically dry records of olive oil and chariot wheels, suddenly brim with ominous words: famine, rations, sacrifices to all gods. Yet nature alone didn't doom the Mycenaeans. Their tablets also speak of something far more human, a system straining under its own weight. Palaces hoarded wealth while outlying villages starved. Armories stockpiled bronze weapons as trade routes faltered, leaving smiths without tin to forge new arms. When the so-called sea peoples began raiding the coasts, whether as external invaders or desperate refugees, the Mycenaeans found themselves overextended, their famed warrior culture crumbling from within. At Pylos, hastily scribbled tablets mention watchmen posted to guard against sea threats, while others begged neighboring cities for grain that never came. The end wasn't a single battle, but a slow suffocation, a civilization choking on its own bureaucracy. But here's the twist: the Mycenaeans didn't vanish entirely. In the shadow of their ruins, smaller communities endured, preserving fragments of their language and legends. The Greek Dark Ages weren't empty. They were a crucible where oral poets kept alive the stories that would become Homer's epics. The very name Mycenaean was lost to history until archaeologists rediscovered it millennia later, proof that collapse isn't always oblivion. Sometimes it's transformation, a scattering of embers waiting to reignite. Their downfall holds a mirror to our own vulnerabilities. Like the Mycenaeans, we've built systems that assume stability: global trade, just-in-time supply chains, centralized power grids. But what happens when the earth shakes, the rains fail, or trust erodes? The warriors of Mycenae never imagined their world could end, yet their silent stones remind us, no civilization, no matter how golden, is immune to the perfect storm. The difference is, we can still read their warnings, etched not just in clay, but in the very landscape they once ruled. Imagine standing on the windswept shores of Rapa Nui, better known as Easter Island, surrounded by the silent gaze of nearly 900 moai, those towering stone sentinels with hollow eyes fixed on some distant horizon. These statues, some weighing as much as 80 tons, weren't just art. They were declarations of power, carved and moved across miles of rugged terrain without wheels or draft animals. Yet behind this awe-inspiring achievement lies a haunting question. How could a society capable of such engineering marvels vanish almost without a trace? The answer isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a cautionary tale written in the very landscape they once ruled. At its peak, Rapa Nui was a thriving Polynesian outpost, its people sustained by lush palm forests and abundant seabirds. But pollen samples tell a grim story. Over centuries, those forests vanished, not from natural disaster, but from human hands. Trees were felled to build sledges for transporting moe, to construct fishing canoes, and to clear land for agriculture. With no wood left to anchor the soil, erosion stripped the island bare. Soon the birds disappeared, their nesting grounds destroyed. The islanders, once master navigators, found themselves trapped on a barren rock, their canoes rotted, their connection to the wider Pacific severed. But deforestation alone doesn't explain the shattered moe found face down near their ahu platforms, or the obsidian spear points littering late-period settlements. As resources dwindled, Rapa Nui's clans likely turned on each other, toppling rival statues in symbolic and then literal warfare. Oral traditions speak of a brutal, long-ear uprising, while skeletal remains show signs of violence and even cannibalism in the island's death throes. Yet this wasn't just mindless destruction. It was the unraveling of a social contract, a society that had gambled on endless growth, only to find itself stranded on the losing side of sustainability. What makes Easter Island's collapse so chilling isn't its isolation, but its familiarity. Like the Maya exhausting their soil or the Sumerians poisoning their fields, the Rapa Nui hit limits they refused to see until it was too late. Their world was finite, but their ambitions weren't. Sound familiar? Today, we face our own version of their dilemma, not on an island, but on a planet with its own invisible boundaries. The difference, we can still read their warning in the moe's hollow eyes. They didn't have satellites to show them the dying forests or global markets to bail them out. We do, yet their story forces us to ask, will we be the first civilization to heed the past, or the last to repeat its mistakes? Standing among those toppled statues, you realize something profound. The moe weren't just monuments to ancestors, they were mirrors. They reflected a society's values, its priorities, and ultimately, its blind spots. The Rapa Nui didn't vanish because they were foolish. They vanished because they were human, a people who, like all of us, believed tomorrow would look like yesterday. Their legacy isn't just a mystery. It's an invitation to look beyond the horizon of our own assumptions before the last tree falls. The rose-red city of Petra glows like an ember in the Jordanian desert, its temples and tombs carved directly into sheer cliffs with such precision that even modern engineers marvel. This was the heart of the Nabatean Empire, a civilization that turned water scarcity into an art form. In a land where rainfall was scarcer than gold, they engineered a hydraulic masterpiece, dams to capture flash floods, ceramic pipes to channel water for miles, and hidden cisterns that allowed Petra to flourish as a jewel in the desert. Their wealth came not from conquest, but from controlling the spice trade, where a single camel caravan could carry frankincense worth a king's ransom. Yet by the 4th century, the city's grand colonnade stood empty, its reservoirs dry. How could the undisputed masters of desert commerce vanish from history's ledger? One clue lies in the shifting sands of global trade. The Nabateans' success depended on their monopoly over two critical routes, the incense trail from southern Arabia and the Silk Road's western spur. But when the Romans mastered monsoon winds to sail directly to India, and Palmyra rose as a rival caravan hub, Petra's middlemen became obsolete. Imagine the slow strangulation as profits dwindled, merchants abandoning the city's markets, engineers no longer maintaining those vital water channels. Yet trade shifts alone don't explain why even local farmers eventually left. The answer may lurk in Petra's very walls. recent studies of their intricate plaster reveal a darker story. The Nabateans coated their cisterns with a unique waterproofing mix, but as their empire declined, repairs grew sloppier. Tree rings from the region show a punishing drought in the 3rd century, one that would have turned their meticulous water systems into relics. Unlike the Maya or Khmer, who faced environmental crises head-on, the Nabateans seemed to lose the very ingenuity that built their wealth. By the time Rome formally annexed their lands in 106, Petra was already a fading star, its people dispersing to smaller oases or blending into neighboring cultures. But here's what makes their disappearance so haunting. The Nabateans didn't just fail, they adapted too well. Their descendants became some of Rome's most skilled traders, their language evolving into modern Arabic dialects. Even Petra's abandonment wasn't complete. Byzantine monks later repurposed its tombs as chapels, and Bedouin tribes sheltered in its caves. Their legacy challenges our definition of collapse. For the Nabateans, disappearance meant trading stone metropolises for mobile networks, proving that empires aren't always lost, sometimes they simply change form. Petra's silent facades now pose a question as sharp as the desert wind. What happens when a civilization's greatest strength becomes its liability? The Nabateans thrived by controlling the flow of goods and water, but when those currents shifted, they couldn't pivot fast enough. Today, as e-commerce rewrites trade maps and droughts return to the Middle East, their story feels unnervingly prescient. The real lesson of Petra isn't about grandeur's fragility, it's about the price of dependence. The desert always wins unless you learn to dance with its whims. The Nabateans did, just not in ways their architects ever envisioned. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro stretch with mathematical precision, their baked brick buildings aligned to the cardinal directions like a modern city planner's dream. This wasn't just urban design, it was genius. The Harappans engineered the world's first municipal drainage systems, with covered sewers and individual household wells, all while contemporaries like Egypt were still relying on the Nile's annual flood for basic sanitation. Their cities thrived for nearly 1,000 years across what's now Pakistan and northwest India, their standardized weights and measures fueling trade from Mesopotamia to the Himalayas. Yet by 1900 BCE, these bustling metropolises emptied, their meticulous grids reclaimed by silt and silence. How does a civilization so advanced, so seemingly prepared for anything, just walk away? The first clue lies in the very rivers that gave them life. Satellite imagery and sediment cores reveal a landscape in motion. The mighty Gaga Hakra River, once the backbone of Harappan agriculture, began shifting its course unpredictably. Some researchers point to tectonic activity that may have altered the region's hydrology, while others argue for climate change. Tree rings from the Himalayan foothills tell of weakening monsoons, turning fertile floodplains into dusty patches. But here's what's fascinating. The Harappans didn't just collapse, they adapted. At sites like Dolavira, archaeologists find reservoirs carved into living rock, proof they fought to harness every drop of erratic rainfall. Their engineering brilliance bought them time, just not enough. Then there's the haunting absence of violence. Unlike the burned cities of Mesopotamia or the mass graves of the Bronze Age, Harappan ruins show no signs of invasion or civil war. Even their art, serene pottery adorned with peacocks and pipal leaves, lacks the warrior motifs common in other ancient cultures. Did peace become their vulnerability? One controversial theory suggests overcrowding and poor sanitation may have bred epidemics, their very urban perfection becoming a death trap. At Mohenjo-Daro, skeletal remains show signs of trauma, but also degenerative diseases. Yet if plague struck, why no mass burials? The truth may be subtler. A slow unraveling as trade routes faltered, as crops failed, as families packed up one by one, leaving behind not corpses but empty doorways. The real shock isn't that the Harappans vanished, it's how they refused to go down fighting. Their decline mirrors their ethos, orderly, pragmatic, quiet. As the cities emptied, smaller villages endured, their pottery styles evolving into what scholars call late Harappan cultures. The script they left behind, still undeciphered, may hold answers, but their greatest lesson lies in the ruins themselves. No civilization, no matter how brilliantly designed, is immune to the whims of nature or the weight of its own success. The Harappans didn't just build cities. They built a mirror showing us the fragile balance between human ingenuity and the forces that can erase even the mightiest of empires without a trace. High on the windswept plains of the Andes, the ruins of Tiwanaku defy logic. Monolithic gateways carved from single stones weighing over 10 tons, walls fitted together so precisely that not even a razor blade slips between them. This wasn't just architecture, it was a dialogue with the impossible. The Tiwanaku thrived at nearly 13,000 feet above sea level, where thin air and bitter cold made every survival a triumph. Yet for centuries, they not only endured, they flourished, turning the shores of Lake Titicaca into a spiritual and agricultural marvel. So how did masters of such precision engineering, people who coaxed harvests from frozen earth, vanish into the highland mist? The first clue lies in the very landscape they transformed. The Tiwanaku didn't just farm, they reinvented agriculture. Their raised field systems, called suka collis, were feats of hydraulic genius. By digging canals between planting beds, they created microclimates that shielded crops from frost and recycled nutrient-rich sediments. These weren't just fields, they were living machines producing bumper harvests even as temperatures fluctuated. But around 1000 AD, something shifted. Sediment cores from Lake Titicaca reveal a prolonged drought, one that would have turned those carefully balanced canals into barren trenches. The Tiwanaku had engineered resilience into their world, yet even resilience has limits. Then there's the mystery of their spiritual heart, the Kalasasaya Temple. Its famous gateway of the sun, adorned with a weeping god, once aligned perfectly with the solstices. But as droughts tightened their grip, the rituals that held society together may have fractured. Archaeologists find evidence of hurried repairs to sacred structures, as if trying to prop up both walls and wavering faith. Unlike the Maya's violent collapse or Rome's bureaucratic decay, Tiwanaku's end feels eerily quiet, a slow dispersal like embers scattering from a dying fire. Yet here's the twist: the Tiwanaku didn't truly disappear. Their descendants, the Aymara people, still work those ancient suka collis, reviving techniques abandoned centuries ago. Their language echoes in place names, their gods merged into Inca lore. This wasn't extinction, it was metamorphosis. The same ingenuity that built monolithic gateways now survives in terraced quinoa fields and woven textiles. Their story challenges our obsession with monumental collapses. Sometimes survival doesn't mean clinging to stone cities, but carrying forward the wisdom to rebuild in new ways. Standing before the ruins of Pumapunku, where andesite blocks were cut with laser-like precision, you're left with a haunting question: how do we define failure? The Tiwanaku's monuments still stand, but their greatest legacy might be the humility to adapt. In an era of climate crises, their raised fields whisper across time. Resilience isn't about conquering nature, it's about dancing with its rhythms even when the music changes. They didn't fail, they simply taught us that collapse and continuity can wear the same face. The Mississippi River once cradled a city so vast, its population rivaled London's at the time, a sprawling metropolis of earthen pyramids, bustling plazas, and neighborhoods stretching far beyond the horizon. This wasn't Europe or Asia. This was Cahokia, the beating heart of a Native American civilization that thrived centuries before Columbus set sail. At its peak, over 20,000 people called this place home, their lives revolving around the towering Monk's Mound, a colossal earthwork covering more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza's base. Yet by the 1400s, the plazas fell silent, the mounds were abandoned, and the forest crept back in. What could bring a city of such grandeur to its knees? Beneath the lush grass of Cahokia's mounds, archaeologists uncover clues to a society pushed to its limits. The city's rise was meteoric, a convergence of fertile floodplains, strategic trade routes, and ingenious farming techniques. But success came at a cost. Tree ring data reveals a chilling pattern. As Cahokia's population exploded, so did deforestation. The very timber that built their homes and fueled their fires vanished, leaving the land vulnerable to erosion. Then came the floods. Sediment cores from nearby lakes show layers of silt deposited in catastrophic bursts, drowning crops and choking waterways. The people who mastered the river suddenly found themselves at its mercy. Yet environmental pressures alone don't explain the broken pottery shards found scattered near ceremonial sites, or the unmarked graves hinting at social upheaval. Cahokia's rulers likely wielded power through control of food surpluses and religious ceremonies, but when harvests failed, faith in that system may have crumbled. One grisly discovery speaks volumes: a mass burial pit containing 53 women and adolescents, their remains suggesting ritualized violence. Was this a desperate attempt to appease the gods, or the unraveling of a social order under strain? The truth may lie somewhere in between, a society buckling under the weight of its own ambition, where the bonds of community frayed under relentless stress. What makes Cahokia's story so poignant isn't just its fall, but its afterlife. Unlike the Maya or Romans, Cahokia left no written records, only whispers in the oral traditions of descendant nations like the Osage and Quapaw. Their mounds, though abandoned, became sacred landmarks for later tribes, and their agricultural innovations, like drought-resistant strains of maize, spread across the continent. Cahokia didn't truly disappear. It scattered its knowledge like seeds on the wind. Standing atop Monk's Mound today, you're left with a haunting question: how different are we, really? Modern cities from New Orleans to Jakarta battle rising waters and sinking ground, while social tensions simmer under the surface. Cahokia's legacy isn't just a tale of collapse, it's a mirror, reflecting the eternal challenge of balancing growth with sustainability, power with resilience. Their mounds still stand, not as tombstones but as silent teachers. The lesson isn't that cities fail, it's that they demand humility, an acknowledgement that even the mightiest civilizations are partners with the land, not its masters. The Tang Dynasty's golden age shimmered like the finest silk, an era when poets like Lai Bai penned verses that still echo through time, when China's capital, Chang'an, was the world's most dazzling metropolis, a melting pot of Persian merchants, Korean scholars, and Tibetan envoys. The empire's reach stretched from the steppes of Central Asia to the jungles of Vietnam, its armies unmatched, its innovations, from woodblock printing to gunpowder, reshaping history. Yet by the 10th century, this glittering superpower didn't so much collapse as dissolve. Its decline so gradual that many scarcely noticed until it was too late. How does an empire so mighty fade so quietly? The first cracks appeared not on the battlefield but in the corridors of power. The Tang's fatal flaw was its own success. To govern its vast territories, the dynasty relied on regional warlords, granting them unprecedented autonomy. At first, this system worked until it didn't. By the mid-8th century, these generals began acting like kings, hoarding taxes and conscripting private armies. The most infamous, An Lushan, a former favorite of Emperor Xuanzong, turned his forces against the throne in 755, unleashing a rebellion so devastating it left millions dead. Though the Tang eventually quashed the revolt, the empire never fully recovered. The court, once a beacon of stability, became a nest of intrigue, with eunuchs and bureaucrats locked in power struggles while bandits and rebels chipped away at the frontiers. But politics only tell half the story. Paleoclimatic data from Chinese cave formations paints a stark picture. The late Tang period coincided with a punishing megadrought. Harvests failed, rivers ran dry, and famine stalked the countryside. In one grim account, a governor resorted to selling official titles for sacks of grain just to feed the capital. The Tang's legendary Grand Canal, designed to ship rice from the fertile south, couldn't compensate for nature's wrath. Yet what's haunting isn't the drought itself, it's the dynasty's response. While poets wrote elegies for lost splendor, the government grew insular, clinging to rituals and titles even as real power seeped away. The bitter irony. The Tang's cultural zenith overlapped with its political decay. Even as warlords carved up the empire, artists produced timeless masterpieces. The poet Du Fu, witnessing the An Lushan rebellion's horrors, penned lines like, "The nation is broken, though hills and rivers remain, a lament for an empire crumbling in slow motion." This duality defines the Tang's legacy, a civilization so vibrant it couldn't see its own fragility. Their poets captured the beauty of transience, yet their rulers failed to grasp its warning. By the time the last Tang emperor abdicated in 907, the dynasty had already become a phantom, its territories fractured among rival kingdoms. Yet like Rome, the Tang never truly vanished. Its legal codes influenced later dynasties, its poetry became China's cultural bedrock, and even its failures offered a playbook for future rulers. The lesson isn't that empires fall, it's that they often outlive themselves in ways their founders never imagined. The Tang didn't collapse, it scattered, its essence surviving not in palaces or armies, but in the brushstrokes of a poem or the glaze of a ceramic vase. Theirs was a decline measured not in battles lost, but in beauty left behind. For centuries, the Norse settlements of Greenland stood as a testament to human resilience, a cluster of stone farms and churches clinging to the edge of the Arctic wilderness. These were Vikings, descendants of the same seafarers who terrorized Europe and discovered North America, yet here they traded longships for sheep pastures, carving out a life where few dared to tread. At their peak, nearly 3,000 people called Greenland home, their livestock grazing on meadows that briefly flourished during the medieval warm period. Then, by the 15th century, silence, the last written record, a wedding certificate from 1408, was found in a ruin. After that, nothing. How could a people who conquered oceans succumb to an icy silence? The answer begins with a slow, creeping enemy, climate change. Core samples from Greenland's ice sheets reveal a brutal shift. The warming that had made farming possible gave way to the Little Ice Age. Summers grew shorter, storms fiercer, and the sea ice that had once receded now choked the fjords for longer each year. The Norse relied on a delicate balance, hay to feed livestock to survive winters, and trade with Europe for iron and grain. But as icebergs multiplied, supply ships from Norway arrived less often, leaving the settlers increasingly isolated. A single bad harvest could mean starvation, and by 1400, the bones of their cattle show signs of malnutrition, their bodies stunted by hunger. The very land that had promised abundance turned against them. Yet weather alone doesn't explain the eerie absence of bodies in the ruins. Unlike other lost civilizations, Greenland's Norse left no mass graves, no evidence of a final, desperate stand. This suggests a quieter tragedy, not a dramatic collapse but a reluctant retreat. Some may have perished on failed voyages back to Iceland, while others could have assimilated with the Thule Inuit who thrived in the same harsh conditions. The Norse had glimpsed the Inuit survival techniques: kayaks, seal hunting, flexible diets, but their rigid European identity may have been their undoing. Church records show they clung to woolen clothing even as leather would have been warmer, and they refused to eat fish, a staple of Inuit diets perhaps due to religious taboos. Pride as much as ice may have sealed their fate, but the haunting question remains: why didn't they adapt? These were the descendants of explorers who'd navigated uncharted oceans. Their ancestors had settled Iceland, survived Vinland's conflicts, and traded with Constantinople. Yet in Greenland, they doubled down on failing strategies, digging deeper into tradition as the world around them changed. Archaeologists find skeletal remains with signs of advanced arthritis, generations of backbreaking labor, trying to farm land that could no longer sustain them. Their churches, once symbols of faith and community, became monuments to a fading dream. The lesson of Greenland's Vikings isn't just about climate or culture, it's about the peril of inflexibility. The Inuit, with their mobile lifestyles and diverse food sources, flourished where the Norse faltered. Today, as melting glaciers rewrite coastlines and resource scarcity looms, their story feels unnervingly prescient. The empty stone walls of Hvalsey Church aren't just relics, they're a warning. The greatest threat to survival isn't always the environment, but the refusal to see beyond what's familiar. The Norse didn't vanish because they were weak. They vanished because they couldn't imagine a different way to be strong. Rising from the savannah like a mirage, the stone towers of Great Zimbabwe still dominate the landscape, ancient walls curving gracefully without mortar, their precise masonry whispering of a lost kingdom's grandeur. This wasn't just a city, it was the heart of an empire built on gold, a trading powerhouse whose wealth reached as far as China and the Middle East. At its peak, Zimbabwe's rulers commanded a network of merchants, their caravans carrying ivory, copper, and shimmering dust from the earth to distant shores. Yet by the 15th century, the capital stood empty, its treasures silent. What unravels a civilization that seemingly held all the cards? The answer lies not in a single catastrophe, but in the very source of its power, gold. For centuries, Zimbabwe's mines were the engine of its prosperity. Archaeologists have uncovered over 4,000 ancient mining shafts across the region, some plunging deep enough to require ventilation systems. The kingdom's elite grew staggeringly rich. Portuguese traders later wrote of a ruler who dined from gold plates while ambassadors knelt on woven silk. But gold, unlike grain or water, can't sustain a society forever. As the most accessible veins were exhausted, miners dug deeper into perilous tunnels, their yields dwindling while the cost soared. The kingdom's wealth, once a blessing, became a trap. Like a gambler doubling down, Zimbabwe's rulers may have invested ever more labor into extraction, straining their people for diminishing returns. Yet even depleted mines don't fully explain the kingdom's retreat from its stone citadel. Pollen samples from nearby lakes reveal another culprit: ecological strain. The city's demand for timber to fuel smelters and build homes stripped the surrounding landscape, triggering erosion that choked rivers and silted up fertile soils. At the same time, shifting trade routes bypassed Zimbabwe as Swahili merchants forged direct links with inland miners. The kingdom, once the middleman, found itself sidelined in its own game. But the most revealing clues lie in the ruins themselves. Unlike the ransacked palaces of other fallen empires, Great Zimbabwe structures show no signs of violence. Instead, archaeologists find evidence of a deliberate, almost orderly departure: precious objects carefully buried, gates sealed rather than shattered. This suggests a society that saw the writing on the wall and chose to adapt rather than fight. Oral traditions speak of a royal lineage relocating to the Mutapa kingdom, trading stone towers for new alliances. Zimbabwe's decline, then, wasn't a collapse, it was a strategic retreat. A recognition that clinging to a fading reality was far riskier than reinvention. The stones of Great Zimbabwe pose a haunting question for our own age of extraction. What happens when a society's greatest asset becomes its Achilles heel? From oil-dependent economies to tech hubs clinging to outdated platforms, the pattern repeats. Zimbabwe's legacy isn't just a warning about resource depletion. It's a lesson in the courage to pivot before the well runs dry. The kingdom didn't fall because it was weak. It faded because it was wise enough not to confuse wealth with resilience. and in that quiet departure, it left behind a testament far more valuable than gold, the wisdom to walk away. The Moch didn't just build cities, they painted their world in vivid detail, leaving behind ceramics so lifelike you can still see the scars on a warrior's cheek or the wrinkles around a shaman's eyes. Along Peru's arid coast, their pyramids rose like giants from the sand, their irrigation canals turning desert into fertile valleys. This was a civilization that thrived for over 700 years, mastering metalwork, weaving, and hydraulic engineering with equal brilliance. Yet by 800 AD, their grand ceremonial centers stood abandoned, their murals flaking under the sun. What could silence a people who seemed to command both earth and art? The answer might lie in the very storms they couldn't control and the violence they immortalized in clay. For the Moch, water was both life and death. Their survival depended on a delicate balance, diverting just enough from seasonal rivers to feed their crops without exhausting the source. But sediment cores from the region reveal a nightmare scenario, a succession of supercharged El Niño events, unleashing floods that would have turned their meticulous canals into raging torrents. At the Huaca de la Luna, archaeologists uncovered layers of silt sandwiched between floors, evidence of repeated deluges. Imagine the despair as walls of mud and water swallowed fields, toppled homes, and poisoned reservoirs with salt. The Moch were engineers, not gods. Their systems could endure a bad year, but not a decade of chaos. Yet nature alone doesn't explain the grim scenes etched into their pottery. Moch art oscillates between beauty and brutality, elaborate feasts alongside graphic depictions of ritual sacrifice. Prisoners are shown with ropes around their necks, their blood collected in ceremonial cups. For years, scholars assumed these were symbolic. Then, at the Pyramid of the Moon, they found the bones, dozens of young men with their throats slit, ribs cracked open, their remains left to mingle with the rain. This wasn't just art, it was testimony, the chilling possibility. The Moch's elites may have doubled down on violence as their world unraveled. When floods disrupted harvests, rulers could have staged ever more extreme sacrifices to appease the gods, desperate to restore order. But faith alone can't fill granaries. Skeletal studies from later periods show signs of widespread malnutrition, particularly among the poor. The very people who built the pyramids might have turned on their leaders, unraveling the social contract that held their world together. But here's the twist. The Moch didn't vanish without a trace. Their DNA lives on in modern Peruvians, their agricultural tricks adopted by later cultures like the Chimu. Their downfall wasn't an erasure, but a transformation. The haunting lesson of their art isn't just about collapse, it's about the cost of clinging to power when the old ways no longer work. The Moch painted their own decline in strokes of ochre and blood, a warning etched not in stone but in clay. Civilizations don't always fall to invaders or earthquakes. Sometimes they collapse under the weight of their own myths. The Assyrian War Machine was unmatched in its brutality, palaces adorned with carvings of flayed prisoners, cities razed to the ground, entire populations marched into exile. This wasn't just conquest, it was psychological warfare on an industrial scale. From the Tigris River to the Nile, the Neo-Assyrian Empire perfected the art of terror, using it to glue together history's first true imperial colossus. Their kings boasted of stacking skulls like grain sacks, of sowing salt in rebellious lands so nothing would grow for generations. For centuries, their strategy worked. But fear, it turns out, is a fuel that burns too hot to last. At its height, Assyria's reach was staggering. They built libraries brimming with cuneiform tablets while simultaneously inventing siege engines that could crush walls. Their capital, Nineveh, was a wonder of aqueducts and botanical gardens, a place where scholars catalogued medicinal plants just miles from dungeons where captured enemies were skinned alive. The empire's strength lay in its relentless efficiency. deporting entire ethnic groups to break regional identities, installing puppet rulers with Assyrian garrisons at their throats, and crushing dissent before it could spread. But this system had a fatal flaw: it demanded constant victory. The moment the empire stopped expanding, the machinery of fear began to rust. The first cracks appeared in the unlikeliest of places, the royal court itself. Succession disputes turned violent as princes vied for the throne, their rivalries splintering the elite. Meanwhile, the very tactics that had cowed their enemies now bred universal hatred. Vassal states from Babylon to Egypt waited for weakness, their grievances simmering beneath forced oaths of loyalty. When the Babylonians finally rebelled in 626 BCE, they weren't alone. The Medes, Scythians, and even former Assyrian allies joined the revolt. The empire that had mastered the art of suppression now faced a coalition united by nothing but shared loathing. Yet the Assyrians' downfall wasn't just political. Tree rings from the region reveal a devastating drought during their final decades, one that would have strained the agricultural surplus needed to feed their massive armies. At the same time, overextension left their borders porous. The empire had grown too large to defend. Its garrison cities stretched thin across thousands of miles. When the combined forces of Babylon and Media laid siege to Nineveh in 612, the Assyrians found themselves trapped in their own nightmare. The city that had once reveled in others' suffering now burned for months, its reservoirs poisoned, its people starving. The revenge was apocalyptic. What's chilling about Assyria's collapse isn't its speed, it's the silence that followed. Unlike Rome or Persia, whose cultures outlived their empires, Assyria's identity was so tied to its brutality that its conquerors erased it with glee. Babylonians smashed their statues, Medes looted their temples, and within generations, even the location of Nineveh was forgotten. The lesson here isn't just about the limits of fear, it's about the cost of building an entire civilization on cruelty. Terror can force obedience, but it can't inspire loyalty. It can win battles, but it can't sustain a society. The Assyrians didn't just fall, they left behind a warning etched in the ruins of their own making. No empire, no matter how terrifying, is immune to the weight of its hubris. 13,000 years ago, a group of hunters roamed the vast grasslands of North America, their fluted spear points razor-sharp and unmistakable, scattered from Montana to Mexico. These were the Clovis people, the continent's first widely recognized culture, their presence marked by elegant stone tools buried beneath millennia of soil. In archaeological terms, their reign was brief, a mere flash between Ice Age glaciers and the rise of later indigenous civilizations. Yet their disappearance was so sudden, it left behind one of prehistory's most perplexing riddles. What could obliterate a society that had mastered an untouched wilderness? Theories swirl like dust devils across the sites where Clovis points still surface. One compelling clue lies in a thin, dark layer of sediment found at numerous Clovis-era dig sites, a stratum rich in exotic materials like nanodiamonds and iridium, substances often linked to cosmic impact. Some researchers propose a cataclysmic comet strike around 12,800 years ago, a fiery bombardment that would have ignited wildfires across the continent and plunged the climate into a deep freeze. Ice core records from Greenland reveal a sudden temperature drop right around this time, an event called the Younger Dryas. For the Clovis, whose survival depended on tracking megafauna like mammoths and giant bison, such a shift could have been apocalyptic. Imagine herds vanishing overnight, grasslands replaced by tundra, and a way of life upended in a geological blink. But not all scientists blame the skies. Others point to the Clovis people's own ingenuity as their undoing. Their spear points, lethal and efficient, may have doomed the very prey they relied on. Sites from Texas to Florida show piles of mammoth bones alongside Clovis artifacts, suggesting these hunters targeted large game with devastating success. In a world without conservation practices, overhunting could have collapsed entire ecosystems. Yet this theory, too, has cracks. Some megafauna species survived for centuries after the Clovis faded, their demise likely tied to broader environmental shifts. Perhaps the most haunting possibility is that the Clovis didn't vanish at all, they simply evolved. Later Paleo-Indian cultures, like the Falsum, used similar but refined tools, hinting at cultural continuity rather than collapse. Genetic studies of ancient remains suggest some Clovis descendants may have assimilated into the populations that became today's indigenous nations. Their legacy might not be extinction but adaptation, a people who reshaped their identity to survive a changing world. What lingers at Clovis sites isn't just mystery, it's humility. These were pioneers navigating a land untouched by humans, their footsteps echoing across millennia. Their story reminds us that survival isn't about permanence but resilience. They didn't leave behind pyramids or temples, just sharpened stone and unanswered questions. And in those fragments, we glimpse our own fragility, the unsettling truth that even the most skilled hunters, the first masters of a continent, could be undone by forces beyond their control. The Clovis challenge us to ask, when the next great shift comes, will we be remembered for what we clung to or how we adapted? History never truly repeats itself, but it often rhymes. As we grapple with climate anomalies, vanishing resources, and widening inequality, the echoes of ancient collapses feel unnervingly familiar. The Maya watched their reservoirs dry up. Today, megacities from Sao Paulo to Chennai ration water as aquifers sink. The Romans saw inflation spiral as their currency lost value. Modern economies wrestle with supply chain shocks and debt burdens that would make even Caesar blanch. These aren't vague similarities, they're patterns etched in the bedrock of human civilization. The critical difference, we have something those vanished societies lacked, the ability to read their stories like cautionary tales. Take infrastructure. The Khmer Empire's canals turned to silt when monsoons shifted, just as today's aging dams strain under unprecedented rainfall. But here's where technology offers a glimmer of hope. Satellites now map groundwater depletion in real time. AI models predict droughts years in advance. Yet knowledge alone isn't power, it's what we do with it that matters. The Greenland Norse had centuries to adopt Inuit survival techniques as their farms failed, yet cultural stubbornness blinded them. Our challenge isn't just innovation, but humility, the willingness to abandon systems that no longer serve us, even if they once made us rich. Then there's the fragility of interdependence. The Bronze Age collapse revealed how tightly linked societies can unravel when one node fails. Sound familiar? A single blocked canal in 2021 sent global shipping into chaos, just as tin shortages paralyzed Bronze Age smiths. Our networks are more resilient, but also more complex, and complexity breeds vulnerability. The Hittites begged allies for grain when drought struck. Today, nations hoard vaccines or semiconductors during crises. The lesson isn't to retreat into isolation, but to build redundancy, to diversify before desperation forces our hand. Perhaps most haunting are the social fractures. Tiwanaku's priests kept repairing temples as famine loomed, mistaking ritual for solutions. Modern parallels abound, from performative politics to corporations prioritizing short-term profits over planetary health. Collapses rarely come from external blows alone. They're accelerated by elites who cling to power while ignoring reality. The Mochica's rulers doubled down on blood sacrifices as floods ravaged their fields, a stark metaphor for societies that treat symptoms rather than causes. But this isn't destiny. The Harappans didn't fight to the last brick. They adapted, dispersing into sustainable communities. Similarly, renewable energy and regenerative agriculture prove we can rewrite the script. What ancient collapses teach us is this: survival favors those who listen to the land, to marginalized voices, to the quiet warnings embedded in crumbling stones. Our edge isn't just technology, it's the chance to choose a different ending. The ruins aren't tombstones, they're guideposts. The real mystery isn't whether we'll heed them, it's whether we'll act in time. The ruins of these empires aren't just relics, they're mirrors. When we walk through the overgrown plazas of Tikal or trace our fingers along the cracked mosaics of Rome, we're not just observing history, we're confronting a question etched into every fallen column and abandoned aqueduct: what does it take to survive? The collapses we've explored weren't sudden explosions. They were slow burns, 1,000 small fractures in the foundation of societies that once seemed unshakable. The Maya's drought, Rome's bureaucratic bloat, the Khmer's monsoon gamble, each was a single thread in a tapestry of unraveling. Yet woven through these stories is a paradox. The very innovations that made these civilizations great often sowed the seeds of their undoing. The Sumerians irrigated their fields into salt wastelands. The Assyrians weaponized fear until it backfired. Even the Greenland Norse, descendants of history's most adaptable explorers, clung to fading traditions as the ice closed in. But here's what's easy to miss: collapse is rarely the end. The Mochica's descendants still shape Peruvian pottery. The Indus Valley's urban blueprints echo in modern city grids. These societies didn't vanish, they transformed. Their knowledge carried forward like embers in the dark. That's the real lesson hidden in the rubble. Resilience isn't about avoiding change, it's about bending without breaking. When the Maya's cities emptied, their people adapted, dispersing into smaller, more sustainable communities. The Khmer's farmers shifted crops when the old ways failed. Even Easter Island survivors, stripped of their forests, learned to fish deeper waters. The past isn't a graveyard, it's a classroom. So where does that leave us? Today's challenges: climate shifts, political polarization, resource depletion aren't new. They're ancient tests wearing modern disguises, but we have something our ancestors lacked: the ability to see the patterns. Satellite imagery replaces guesswork about dwindling rivers. Global communication lets us share solutions across continents. The critical question isn't whether we'll face crises, it's whether we'll repeat the fatal mistake of mistaking stability for permanence. Civilizations don't fall because they're weak, they fall because they forget how to adapt. That's why these ruins matter. They're not just cautionary tales, they're invitations. When you look at the overgrown pyramids of Cahokia or the wind-scoured stones of Great Zimbabwe, you're not just seeing collapse, you're seeing choices. The choice to hoard or share, to fight or collaborate, to cling to the past or reinvent the future. The stones don't speak, but their silence is loud enough. The next chapter isn't written yet, and unlike those who came before us, we can still read the warnings. So what do you think? Which empire's story resonates with you? Share your thoughts below, and if you're hungry for more deep dives into history's greatest mysteries, don't forget to subscribe. After all, the best way to honor these lost worlds isn't just to remember them. It's to learn from them.